At 5:42 p.m. on a quiet January evening, a call for service reached the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. The location was an unremarkable home in Duarte, California. When deputies arrived, T.K. Carter was already gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of foul play, no dramatic scene that would later be reconstructed in headlines or courtrooms. Just a still house, an unanswered phone call, and a life that ended without witnesses. To the world, T.K. Carter was a familiar face, the kind you recognize instantly, even if you struggle to place the name. He was part of iconic films, classic television, and decades of American pop culture. Yet his final hours unfolded far from cameras, far from sets, and far from the industry that once relied on his presence. Why did his death arrive with so few answers? What happened in the hours before that call was made? And how does a man who spent nearly 50 years working in Hollywood come to leave it so quietly? This is not a story about scandal breaking in real time. It is a story about absence, about what happens when the noise fades, the roles grow smaller, and the spotlight no longer follows. Tonight, we slow time down. We retrace the final hours of T.K. Carter's life, not just to ask how he died, but to understand how he lived, what he carried with him, and why his ending feels heavier because it was so silent.
The news did not arrive with sirens or breaking news banners. It surfaced quietly, first as a short report, then as a handful of headlines repeating the same few lines. Found deceased at home, no foul play suspected. Cause of death not yet released. For many readers, it took a moment to register the name. Then came recognition, a face, a scene, a line of dialogue remembered from years ago. For some, it was The Thing. For others, Punky Brewster, Runaway Train, or a familiar guest role on television that had once played in the background of their lives. Within hours, social media filled with a specific kind of reaction, not explosive grief, but quiet surprise. Colleagues shared photos from decades earlier. Fans posted clips and stills, often writing the same sentence in different ways. I didn't know his name, but I knew his face. That contrast became the first unsettling layer of the story. Here was an actor whose career spanned nearly half a century, whose resume crossed generations and genres, yet his death passed without the collective pause reserved for household names. There were no immediate press conferences, no dramatic statements from studios, just confirmations from law enforcement in a growing sense that something important had ended without ceremony. And then came the unanswered questions. Why was the cause of death withheld? What prompted the service call in the first place? Who was expecting to hear from him that day and didn't? In Hollywood, silence often speaks louder than scandal. The absence of details invites speculation, not because there is evidence of wrongdoing, but because the human mind struggles to accept endings without explanation. As the news spread, another realization settled in. T.K. Carter had been working almost until the end, appearing in television projects just a couple of years earlier. He hadn't disappeared entirely. He had simply drifted to the edges, where careers often continue quietly, unseen by the wider public. To many, his passing felt less like a sudden shock and more like the delayed recognition of a life slowly moving out of view. And that raised a deeper question, one that would not let go. How does someone stay present in an industry for decades, yet leave it almost unnoticed? To answer that, we have to rewind, not to the final day, but to the long road that led there.
Long before the quiet house in Duarte, before the unanswered call and the unanswered questions, T.K. Carter's story began in motion. Born in December 1956 and raised in Los Angeles, Carter was drawn to performance unusually early.
While many children were still imagining futures, he was already stepping onto stages, learning timing, rhythm, and the fragile power of making people react. By his early teens, he was doing stand-up comedy, not as a novelty, but as discipline. Comedy clubs, small stages, dim rooms where laughter had to be earned, not assumed. By high school, Carter had moved beyond comedy alone. He studied theater, appearing in stage productions and eventually landing a role in a production of The Odd Couple. It was the kind of formative experience that convinces a young performer that this life, unstable, uncertain, but electric, is worth pursuing. The 1970s brought his first screen appearances. They were not glamorous roles, small parts, guest spots, faces that appeared briefly and vanished. Shows like Policewoman, The Waltons, and The Jeffersons placed him inside living rooms across America, even if viewers didn't yet know his name. But Carter wasn't chasing instant fame. He was building something slower, a reputation for reliability, range, and presence. He trained at comedy in improvisation spaces like the Comedy Store, absorbing the unspoken rules of survival in Hollywood. Be adaptable, be ready, don't wait for permission. Then, in 1982, everything shifted. The Thing arrived, a film that would later become legendary, though its impact wasn't fully understood at the time. Carter played Knowles, the cook, a member of an isolated crew unraveling under paranoia and fear. It wasn't a flashy role, but it was human, grounded, essential. Years later, audiences would re-watch The Thing and notice something new: how Carter's performance anchored scenes of chaos with quiet realism. He wasn't the monster, he wasn't the hero, he was the person in between. That role changed the trajectory of his career. Suddenly, he was no longer just another guest actor, he was a known quantity. The mid-1980s followed with Runaway Train, where he appeared alongside powerhouse performances in a film steeped in desperation and confinement, themes that in hindsight feel uncomfortably prophetic. Television followed closely behind. In Punky Brewster, Carter became Mike Fulton, a recurring presence across multiple seasons. For many viewers, especially younger ones, this was where his face became familiar. He wasn't the lead, but he was part of the emotional texture of the show. Dependable, recognizable, safe. Throughout the 1990s, Carter worked steadily. Comedies, dramas, voice work. He appeared in Space Jam, voiced characters, and moved fluidly between genres. Later came roles on shows like The Steve Harvey Show, Moesha, The Nanny, and NYPD Blue. On paper, it looked like success. Decades of work, dozens of credits, a career many aspiring actors would envy. But beneath the surface, something quieter was happening. The industry was changing. Roles became more competitive. Aging in Hollywood was not gentle, especially for actors who were not constant headline makers. Carter continued to work, but increasingly in smaller parts, guest appearances, short arcs, supporting roles that required the same commitment but offered less visibility. Still, he kept showing up. Even in the 2000s and 2010s, he remained active. Projects like The Corner, How to Get Away with Murder, Everybody Hates Chris, and later Dave and The Company You Keep kept him connected to the craft. His final television appearance came in 2023. There was no farewell announcement, no final bow, just another credit, another role completed. And somewhere along the way, the applause faded, not because the work stopped, but because the world moved on. By the time his final years arrived, T.K. Carter had lived a life defined by persistence rather than spectacle, a career built on being present, even when presence no longer guaranteed attention. That long, quiet erosion of visibility would shape the emotional landscape of his final chapter, a chapter defined less by scandal and more by something harder to name: the slow narrowing of space. There was no single scandal that marked T.K. Carter's decline, no tabloid meltdown, no public collapse caught on camera. And that, perhaps, is what makes his story harder to process.
In Hollywood, suffering often becomes visible only when it is loud. But Carter's challenges unfolded in a quieter register, one that rarely earns headlines. As the years passed, the roles grew smaller, not because his talent diminished, but because the system around him shifted. New faces arrived, new trends replaced old rhythms. For actors who built careers on consistency rather than superstardom, the margin for error narrowed with age. Carter continued to work, but working and being seen are not the same thing. In interviews later in life, he spoke candidly about the difficulty of simply getting auditions. At one point, he admitted that a close friend had to intervene just to secure him a chance to read for The Corner, a project that would later be praised for its realism and depth. That revelation landed softly at the time, but in hindsight, it reveals something deeper. This was an actor with decades of experience, proven range, and a respected resume, still needing favors to enter the room. That reality takes a toll. Hollywood has a way of disguising rejection as routine, emails that never arrive, calls that stop coming, opportunities that shrink until they resemble obligations rather than possibilities. There is no official notice that your relevance is fading. There is only the silence. For Carter, the silence did not mean inactivity. He kept honing his craft, appearing in series and films whenever the door opened. But the emotional cost of sustained marginalization is difficult to measure. Actors are trained to disappear into roles, but they are not immune to erasure themselves. By his later years, Carter was no longer part of promotional cycles or red carpet conversations. His presence on set became brief, functional, professional, and then gone. Friends and colleagues remembered him as kind, prepared, and serious about the work. Not bitter, not explosive, but professionalism can also be a mask. There is a particular loneliness that comes from being needed only intermittently, from being called when convenient, then released back into obscurity. Unlike scandals or addictions, this form of erosion leaves no clear villain. It is systemic, slow, impersonal, and it often unfolds behind closed doors. As Carter moved into his 60s, the gap between his past visibility and present reality widened. He had survived Hollywood, but survival is not the same as fulfillment. Still, there were no public warnings, no alarming social media posts, no final interview hinting at despair. To the outside world, everything looked fine, which is why what happened next feels so unsettling. Because when a life ends quietly, without explanation, the absence of visible struggle does not bring comfort. It leaves questions, heavier ones. Questions that begin to gather in the days and weeks before the end. In the weeks leading up to his death, nothing about T.K. Carter's life suggested an ending was near. There were no public cancellations to explain, no urgent medical disclosures, no cryptic messages posted late at night. From the outside, his life appeared settled, modest, routine, unremarkable in the way many lives become after decades of steady work. He had already given Hollywood what it would take from him. What remained was quieter. Friends did not describe panic. There were no reports of erratic behavior or alarming distress. If there were worries, they stayed private, folded into the everyday rhythms of someone used to carrying things alone. That is often how late-life pressure manifests, not as chaos, but as endurance. Carter had spoken openly in recent years about how hard it had become to secure auditions, not with anger, but with a tone that suggested acceptance, a man acknowledging the rules of a game he had played long enough to know it would not change for him. Acceptance, however, is not the same as relief. For actors whose identities are shaped by work, long gaps between roles can create an unfamiliar emptiness. Days without scripts, weeks without calls, months without proof that the craft still has a place for them. Carter was not inactive.
He had appeared on television not long before, contributing to series that found new audiences online. But momentum is fragile, especially when it no longer belongs to you. In those final weeks, there were no farewell gestures, no reunion interviews, no announcement that he was stepping away. Life simply continued. And sometimes, that is what makes the ending hardest to see. Because when nothing appears broken, no one thinks to check the cracks. The final days passed without incident, or at least without anything recorded. No witnesses stepped forward later to say they sensed danger. No last-minute calls that would later be dissected by reporters. Whatever he was carrying, he carried it quietly. And then came the final day. A day that, at first glance, looked no different from the many that came before it. What is known about T.K. Carter's final 24 hours is limited, and that limitation is part of the story. There is no public timeline filled with dramatic movements, no confirmed meetings, no recorded last words. According to law enforcement, Carter was found deceased in his home in Duarte, California, after a call for service was made at approximately 5:42 p.m. Deputies arrived and pronounced him dead at the scene. There were no signs of foul play. That is where the official narrative begins and almost immediately ends. No cause of death was released. No medical emergency was described. No explanation was offered for what prompted the call. The hours before that moment remain largely undocumented, but absence does not mean emptiness. In the quiet of a private home, time moves differently. There are no witnesses to narrate it, no cameras to frame it, no script to guide it. The final day likely began as many others had. Morning light filtering into familiar rooms, the weight of routine pressing gently but persistently. There is no indication that Carter left his home that day. No public record of travel, no last appearance in public spaces. If there were phone calls, they were private. If there were messages, they have not been disclosed. What is clear is that no emergency unfolded in public view. No ambulance rushing through traffic, no neighbors reporting a disturbance, no dramatic intervention. Instead, the end came quietly, inside a space meant for rest, not farewell. When deputies entered the house, they encountered stillness, the kind of stillness that does not ask questions, but creates them. At that moment, a life shaped by performance, movement, and dialogue reached its conclusion without an audience. And perhaps that is the most unsettling detail of all. Because for an actor, someone whose existence was defined by being seen, the final act occurred unseen. Time did not stop dramatically. It simply ceased. The clock continued to move. Outside, the world carried on. And somewhere between the last moment of awareness and the arrival of help, T.K. Carter crossed a line that no amount of experience or resilience could undo. The lack of information invites restraint. It would be easy to speculate, but speculation is not truth. What can be said with certainty is that the end was not violent, not chaotic, not theatrical. It was quiet. And quiet endings have a way of echoing longer than loud ones, because they force us to confront something uncomfortable, that a life can close without explanation, without warning, and without resolution. But the story did not end there, because once the stillness was broken, the questions began. After T.K. Carter was found deceased, the machinery of procedure moved quickly, and then, almost immediately, slowed to a standstill. Law enforcement confirmed the basic facts: the time of the call, the location, the absence of foul play, and then nothing more. There was no detailed press briefing, no follow-up clarification, no public release explaining what happened inside that house in Duarte. In most cases, silence like this eventually breaks. A medical examiner issues a report, a cause of death is listed, the story finds closure even if it brings discomfort. But in Carter's case,
the silence lingered. Media outlets repeated the same lines, word for word. Found at home, no foul play suspected, cause of death not disclosed. Each repetition amplified the same uncomfortable gap. For fans and observers, the lack of information became its own source of unease, not because it suggested conspiracy, but because it offered no context, no narrative frame to hold grief. Questions emerged quietly, then spread. Was there an underlying medical condition that had never been public? Did he pass suddenly, without warning, or had something been building beneath the surface? Why was nothing being shared, not even in broad terms? In the absence of answers, restraint mattered. There were no credible reports of criminal investigation, no statements hinting at negligence or misconduct, and no evidence that Carter's death was anything other than natural or medical in nature. Still, uncertainty has weight. For someone whose career had played out in front of audiences for decades, the idea that his final chapter would remain private felt jarring, almost unfinished. Colleagues who spoke out did so with respect and brevity. They shared memories, not theories, moments from sets, images from younger years. No one rushed to define his ending. And that, too, says something. Sometimes the absence of controversy is not a sign that nothing mattered, but that what mattered was too personal to reduce to a headline. As days passed, the story drifted from front pages to archives, another name added to a list of losses. But for those who paused long enough to notice, something lingered. Not suspicion, not outrage, a sense of quiet discomfort. Because unresolved endings do not disappear, they simply fade into the background, carrying their questions with them. And eventually, what remains is not how someone died, but how their life is remembered once the noise subsides. Which brings us to the final consideration. What does T.K. Carter leave behind when we look at his life from the vantage point of his final hours?
When the questions finally settle, when the headlines stop updating and the silence becomes permanent, what remains of a life like T.K. Carter's is not a single moment, but a pattern. He leaves behind no scandal to dissect, no shocking revelation to redefine him, no final quote that will be printed and reprinted. What he leaves instead is presence. A presence scattered across decades of film and television, across scenes that still play, lines that still land, faces that still feel familiar, even when names are forgotten. T.K. Carter was never positioned as a star who dominated marquees. He was something quieter, and in many ways rarer, a working actor who endured, someone who showed up, adapted, and remained part of the industry even as it shifted beneath his feet. Seen from the perspective of his final hours, his life tells a story that is uncomfortable precisely because it is common. The story of a man who did everything right, trained, worked, persisted, and still found himself aging into the margins of a system that celebrates novelty more than longevity. A man whose value was never in question on set, but whose visibility gradually dissolved once the cameras stopped rolling. His death did not arrive with spectacle, it arrived with stillness. And in that stillness is a mirror. Because many lives do not end in grand finales, they end in ordinary rooms on ordinary days, carrying years of unseen effort and unspoken fatigue. Looking back, T.K. Carter's final hours ask us to reconsider what success actually looks like. Is it fame that endures, or work that quietly holds its place in the lives of others? Is it being remembered loudly, or being present honestly, even when recognition fades? For viewers who grew up watching him, knowingly or not, his performances remain. They exist independent of how his life ended. They continue to reach new audiences who will discover his face long after the circumstances of his death are forgotten. And perhaps that is the most human legacy of all. Not the answers we never received, but the work that continues to speak. In the end, T.K. Carter's story is not defined by mystery or scandal. It is defined by endurance and by the quiet cost of carrying a career to its natural conclusion in an industry that rarely pauses to say goodbye. As the lights dim on his final scene, there is no dramatic cue, only the soft recognition that a familiar presence is gone. And that sometimes the most haunting endings are the ones that ask nothing from us, except to remember.